June 14, 2024, the day diplomacy died in silence. Let me tell you something most people missed that day. The headlines were full of the usual noise: Ukraine this, NATO that, another round of sanctions, another speech about defending democracy. But beneath the surface, something far more consequential happened. The White House, in a single, almost offhand remark, declared an end to an era. Not with a bang, not with a press conference, but with a quiet, devastating "talks are done, only actions matter now." Now, if you're like most Americans, you probably heard that and thought, well, finally. Enough talking. Time to act. But here's the thing: I've spent the last 4 decades studying war, strategy, and the mechanics of great power conflict. I've advised generals, testified before Congress, and watched empires rise and fall from the inside. And when I heard those words, I didn't feel relief. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. Because that statement wasn't just about Ukraine. It wasn't even just about Russia. It was the death rattle of American diplomacy. And what comes next won't be quick, clean, or controllable. The question isn't whether we're heading toward war, it's how bad it's going to get before we realize we've already lost. The official what they want you to believe. The story goes like after 2 years of brutal, unprovoked Russian aggression in Ukraine, the West has finally run out of patience. Putin is a war criminal, a dictator who only understands force. Sanctions have crippled his economy. NATO has stood firm. And now, with Ukraine on the verge of a breakthrough, thanks to billions in American weapons and training, the moment has come to push for total victory. No more negotiations. No more half measures. The time for talking is over. What matters now is more weapons, more intelligence sharing, more pressure on Moscow until the Kremlin collapses or surrenders. The data seems to back this up. The U.S. has committed over $175 billion in military and economic aid to Ukraine since 2022. NATO has extended to 32 members, with Finland and Sweden joining the alliance. Russian forces have suffered staggering losses. Estimates range from 120,000 to 300,000 casualties, depending on who you ask. The ruble is weak, oligarchs are sanctioned, and Putin's approval ratings, while still high, are under strain. The Pentagon's own assessments suggest that with another year of Western support, Ukraine could retake significant territory, possibly even Crimea. The media narrative is equally clear. CNN, The New York Times, and The Washington Post have run countless stories about Ukrainian bravery, Russian war crimes, and the moral imperative to support Kyiv until the bitter end. Polls show that a majority of Americans still support aid to Ukraine, though that support is softening, particularly among Republicans. The Biden administration has framed this as a generational struggle between democracy and autocracy, a battle that will define the 21st century. And on the surface, it all makes sense. Why negotiate with a tyrant? Why reward aggression? If we don't stop Putin now, won't China be emboldened to invade Taiwan? The logic is seductive. It's the same logic that led us into Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. This time, it'll be different. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the numbers. The U.S. has indeed sent Ukraine an enormous amount of aid. $175 billion is a staggering figure. But here's what they don't tell: only about 30% of that has actually been spent on weapons. The rest? Economic aid, humanitarian assistance, and, critically, debt payments. Ukraine's economy is in freefall. Its GDP has contracted by 30% since 2021. Inflation is running at 26%. The country is effectively a ward of the West, propped up by loans and grants that will never be repaid. This isn't a sustainable model. It's a financial black hole. Then there's the battlefield. The much-hyped Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 failed spectacularly. Despite billions in Western armor and training, Ukrainian forces were chewed up by Russian minefields, drones, and artillery. The front lines have barely moved in over a year. Meanwhile, Russia has adapted. Its defense industry is now on a war footing, producing artillery shells at a rate of 3 million per year, more than the entire West combined. Moscow has also secured new supply lines through North Korea and Iran, mitigating the impact of sanctions. But here's the idea that Putin is on the ropes is pure fantasy. Russian military losses, while heavy, are not existential. Russia has a population of 143 million. It can afford to lose 300,000 men. It has already mobilized over 300,000 reservists, with another 500,000 under contract. The Russian economy, contrary to Western predictions, has not collapsed. In fact, it grew by 3.6% in 2023, fueled by military Keynesianism and trade with China, India, and the global South. Sanctions have hurt, but they haven't broken Moscow. And let's be honest, when has economic pressure ever forced a nuclear-armed state to surrender? Now, let's talk about the no negotiations stance. This isn't just about principle. It's about power. The Biden administration has repeatedly moved the goalposts. First, it was Ukraine must survive. Then it was Ukraine must retake all its territory. Now, it's Russia must be defeated and Putin removed. This isn't strategy. It's escalation without end. And the reason is the US cannot afford to lose. Not because of Ukraine, but because of China. Here's what's really going: Washington sees this war as a proxy conflict to weaken Russia before pivoting to the main event, Taiwan. The thinking goes like, if we bleed Russia dry in Ukraine, China will think twice about invading Taiwan. It's a classic Cold War playbook. The problem? It's not working. Russia isn't collapsing. China isn't deterred. And the longer this drags on, the more the US risks overstretch, economic strain, and most dangerously, direct conflict with a nuclear power. But the most damning part? The US has been quietly sabotaging peace talks from the very beginning. Remember Istanbul in March 2022? Ukraine and Russia were close to a deal: a neutral Ukraine, security guarantees, a phased withdrawal of Russian troops. Then Boris Johnson flew to Kiev and told Zelensky to keep fighting. The US and UK made it no negotiations. The war had to continue. Why? Because the goal was never just to save Ukraine. It was to break Russia. And that's where we are today. Talks are done, only actions matter now. We're all in. No off-ramps. No diplomacy. Just war until one side breaks. But here's the thing about wars: like, they don't end the way you think they will. The broader geopolitical why this isn't just about Ukraine. Let me put this in context: what we're witnessing isn't just a regional conflict. It's the death throes of the American-led unipolar world order. And the three great powers, Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, are playing for keeps. The US is clinging to its post-Cold War dominance, but the world has changed. The unipolar moment is over. China's GDP is now larger than America's in purchasing power parity. Russia, despite its economic limitations, remains a nuclear superpower with vast natural resources and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. The global South, India, Brazil, South Africa, the Gulf states, is no longer willing to blindly follow Washington's lead. They're hedging. They're trading with Russia. They're buying oil in rubles and yuan. They're refusing to sanction Moscow. This is the reality the Biden administration refuses to accept. The US is still operating under the assumption that it can dictate the rules of the international system. That it can isolate Russia, contain China, and maintain global hegemony. But that era is ending. The world is moving toward multipolarity, whether Washington likes it or not. Now, let's talk about spheres of influence. The US has spent the last 30 years extending NATO right up to Russia's borders, despite repeated warnings from Moscow. In 2008, NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join the alliance. In 2014, the US backed a coup in Kiev that overthrew a democratically elected, Russia-friendly government. From Moscow's perspective, this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about survival. It's about preventing NATO from stationing missiles in Kharkiv, 300 miles from Moscow. I'm not saying Putin's invasion was justified. It wasn't. But let's be the US would never tolerate a hostile military alliance on its borders. Imagine if Mexico joined a Chinese-led military bloc. Imagine if Beijing stationed hypersonic missiles in Tijuana. The US would go to war. And yet, we expect Russia to accept NATO action without a fight. This is the hypocrisy at the heart of American foreign policy. We demand that other nations respect our sphere of influence, but we refuse to recognize theirs. And now, we're shocked that Russia is pushing back. But here's where it gets even more dangerous. The US isn't just fighting Russia in Ukraine. It's also preparing for war with China. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy explicitly identifies China as the pacing threat and Russia as an acute threat. The US is shifting its military posture toward the Indo-Pacific, but it's still bogged down in Europe. And that's a problem. Because China is watching. And it's learning. Beijing sees how the US has weaponized the dollar, frozen Russian assets, and cut Moscow off from the SWIFT payment system. It sees how NATO has exited, despite Russia's objections. And it's drawing conclusions. If the US can do this to Russia, what's to stop it from doing the same to China? The lesson for Beijing isn't "don't invade Taiwan." It's "become so powerful that the US can't touch you." And that's exactly what China is doing. It's building hypersonic missiles, exiting its navy, and developing a world-class semiconductor industry. It's forging alliances with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It's creating alternative financial systems to bypass the dollar. And it's waiting for the right moment to make its move. This is the grand strategic dilemma the US faces. We're trying to fight two wars at once, one in Europe, one in Asia. While our economy is stretched thin, our society is polarized, and our military is struggling to recruit. And we're doing it all under the delusion that we can maintain global dominance forever. History doesn't work that way. Military, the illusion of a quick victory. Let's talk about the military situation. Because this is where the rubber meets the road. And what I'm about to tell you will make the armchair generals in Washington very uncomfortable. First, the idea that Ukraine can win this war in any meaningful sense is a fantasy. Even if Kiev manages to push Russian forces out of all occupied territory, which is unlikely, Moscow will never accept defeat. Russia has already annexed 4 Ukrainian regions. It has declared them part of the Russian Federation. And in Russian strategic doctrine, an attack on its territory is an attack on Russia itself. That means nuclear escalation is on the table. Now, I know what the hawks will. Putin's bluffing. He won't use nukes. Maybe. But are we really willing to bet the future of the planet on that assumption? Because here's the thing about nuclear, it's not a game. Once the first tactical nuke is used, the genie is out of the bottle. And the US has no good answers for what comes in. But let's set nukes aside for a moment. Even a conventional victory is a pipe dream. The Russian military has adapted. It's learned from its early mistakes. It's now fighting a war of attrition, a war it can afford to lose for years, while Ukraine cannot. The West's industrial base is struggling to keep up with Russian production. The US is sending Ukraine artillery shells that we don't have in stock. We're cannibalizing our own reserves to keep Kiev in the fight. And for what? So Ukraine can retake a few more miles of territory while its economy collapses and its population flees? This isn't a war Ukraine can win. It's a war it can only survive. And the longer it drags on, the worse the outcome will be for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the US. Now, let's talk about NATO. The alliance has been hailed as a bulwark of Western strength. But here's the dirty little: NATO is not prepared for a real war with Russia. Not even close. The US has been warning Europe for years that it needs to increase defense spending. And what's happened? Germany, the richest country in Europe, is still struggling to meet its 2% GDP target. Most European militaries are hollowed out. They lack ammunition, spare parts, and trained personnel. And they're completely dependent on the US for intelligence, logistics, and most critically, nuclear deterrence. This is not a recipe for success. It's a recipe for disaster. Because if this war escalates, if Russia decides to strike a NATO member, or if the US gets dragged into a direct conflict, the alliance will fracture. Europe doesn't have the stomach for a real war. And the US can't fight Russia and China at the same time. I've been warning about this for years. The US military is stretched thin. Our forces are exhausted. Our equipment is aging. And our strategy is stuck in the 20th century. We're still preparing to fight the last war, while our adversaries are building the armies of the future. And the worst part? The American people have no idea how close we are to the edge. The domestic political why this war won't end. Let's talk about politics. Because this war isn't just about geopolitics. It's about elections. It's about money. It's about power. The Biden administration has tied its entire foreign policy legacy to Ukraine. If the war ends in a negotiated settlement, it will be seen as a defeat. And in Washington, defeat is unacceptable. So the White House has no choice but to double down. More weapons. More sanctions. More escalation. Because the alternative is admitting failure. But here's the American people are getting tired. Support for Ukraine aid is softening, especially among Republicans. And with the 2024 election looming, the White House is in a bind. If Biden pulls back on Ukraine, he loses the hawkish wing of his party. If he keeps pouring money into the war, he risks alienating voters who are more concerned about inflation, immigration, and the economy. And then there's Trump. The former president has made it clear that he wants to end the war quickly. He's called for negotiations. He's criticized NATO. And if he wins in November, the entire US strategy could shift overnight. This is the domestic political reality. The war in Ukraine has become a partisan issue. And that makes it even more dangerous. Because in Washington, foreign policy is no longer about what's best for the country. It's about what's best for the next election. But here's the military-industrial complex is making a killing. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, they're all seeing record profits. And they have powerful allies in Congress. The more the war drags on, the more money they make. And the more money they make, the more they lobby for the war to continue. This is how empires decline. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not with a grand strategy, but with short-term political calculations. Not with a vision for the future, but with a desperate clinging to the past. Scenario how this ends. So where do we go from here? Let's run through the scenarios. Scenario 1, the best-case outcome. Ukraine launches a successful counteroffensive in 2025, retakes significant territory, and forces Russia to the negotiating table. A ceasefire is declared. Ukraine remains neutral. Russia keeps Crimea and parts of the Donbass. The war ends with a whimper, not a bang. The US declares victory and pivots to China. But here's this scenario requires Russia to accept defeat. And Putin has already shown that he's willing to escalate rather than lose. So even if Ukraine makes gains, Moscow could respond with tactical nukes, cyber attacks on NATO infrastructure, or strikes on Western supply lines. And then we're in uncharted territory. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. The war grinds on for another 2 to 3 years. Ukraine holds the line, but can't make significant gains. Russia digs in, fortifies its positions, and waits for Western support to collapse. The US and Europe grow weary. Aid slows. Ukraine's economy collapses. Zelensky is forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. Russia keeps most of its gains. The West declares victory anyway. This is the most probable outcome. But it's not a victory. It's a stalemate. And stalemates in war are dangerous. Because they create the conditions for the next conflict. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. The war escalates. Russia strikes a NATO member, either accidentally or deliberately. The US responds with airstrikes. Moscow retaliates with cyber attacks on American infrastructure. The conflict spirals out of control. Tactical nukes are used. the global economy collapses. And before we know it, we're in World War III. This is the scenario no one wants to talk about. But it's the one we should be preparing for. Because the longer this war drags on, the higher the risk of miscalculation. And in a world with thousands of nuclear weapons, miscalculation is an existential threat. The grand strategy why America keeps losing. Let's step back for a moment. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about a pattern of American strategic incompetence that stretches back decades. And if we don't recognize it, we're doomed to repeat it. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't the first time the US has found itself in a proxy war with a nuclear-armed adversary, only to discover too late that the rules of the game have changed. In Korea, we fought China to a stalemate. In Vietnam, we fought the Soviets and Chinese by proxy and lost. In Afghanistan, we fought the Soviets, then the Taliban, and lost again. And now, in Ukraine, we're fighting Russia, and the outcome is looking eerily familiar. Let me explain why this matters. The US foreign policy establishment operates on a set of assumptions that are fundamentally flawed. First, they assume that American military power is so overwhelming that no adversary will dare challenge it directly. Second, they assume that economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure can force adversaries to capitulate. Third, they assume that our allies will follow our lead without question. And fourth, they assume that the American public will tolerate endless wars as long as they're sold as necessary for democracy or human rights. All four of these assumptions are wrong. And the war in Ukraine is proving it. Take the first assumption: American military dominance. The US spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. Our technology is unmatched. Our training is elite. Our logistics are unparalleled. And yet, in Ukraine, we're discovering that none of that matters as much as we thought. Russia has adapted. They've learned from their mistakes. They've integrated drones, electronic warfare, and massed artillery in ways that have neutralized many of our advantages. And they've done it while suffering losses that, by Western standards, should have broken them. The uncomfortable truth is that the era of American military dominance is over. We're entering an age of parity, where even second-tier powers like Russia can challenge us in ways we're not prepared for. Now, let's talk about sanctions. The Biden administration, along with the EU, imposed the most sweeping economic sanctions in history on Russia. They froze hundreds of billions in foreign reserves. They kicked Russian banks out of SWIFT. They banned imports of Russian oil and gas. And what happened? Russia's economy didn't collapse. In fact, it grew by 3.6% in 2023, according to the IMF. Their defense industry is producing more artillery shells than the US and Europe combined. And they've found new markets in China, India, and the global south. Meanwhile, Europe is facing deindustrialization, energy shortages, and political instability. The sanctions regime has backfired spectacularly. And yet, no one in Washington is willing to admit it. Here's the thing about sanctions: they only work if they're universally enforced. And in a multipolar world, that's no longer possible. China, India, Brazil, South Africa, they're not going to follow our lead. They see this as a US-led economic war, and they're hedging their bets. The result? Russia is more isolated from the West, but more integrated with the rest of the world. And the US is left holding the bag, trying to convince its allies to keep funding a war that's bleeding them dry. Which brings me to the third flawed assumption: allies will follow our lead. Europe is fracturing. Poland and the Baltic states are all in on Ukraine, but Germany, France, and Italy are wavering. Hungary is openly defying Brussels. The Dutch just elected a government that wants to cut aid to Ukraine. And in the US, support is collapsing. A recent Pew poll found that only 31% of Americans believe the US is providing the right amount of support to Ukraine. Another 44% say we're doing too much. And yet, the Biden administration keeps pushing for more money, more weapons, more war. They're out of touch with reality. The final assumption, the American public will tolerate endless wars, is the most dangerous of all. The US has been at war for 23 years. We've spent over $8 trillion on the global war on terror. We've lost thousands of lives. And what do we have to show for it? Iraq is a failed state. Afghanistan is back in Taliban hands. Libya is a haven for terrorists. Syria is a Russian-Iranian client. And now, we're risking a direct conflict with Russia over a country that isn't even a NATO member. The American people are exhausted. They're not buying the narrative anymore. And when the public turns against a war, the politicians follow. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's what happened in Iraq. And that's what's happening now in Ukraine. So where does this leave us? The war in Ukraine isn't just a regional conflict. It's a symptom of a much larger problem, the collapse of American strategic thinking. We've spent the last 30 years assuming that we could reshape the world in our image through military force, economic coercion, and moral suasion. And we've failed. Spectacularly. Now, some will say that I'm being too pessimistic. That the US is still the world's preeminent power. That we can outlast Russia. That we can pivot to China and contain both adversaries simultaneously. But that's the same kind of thinking that got us into this mess. The reality is that we're overstretched. Our military is worn out. Our economy is burdened by debt. Our society is divided. And our adversaries know it. Let me give you an example. In 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, the Obama administration imposed sanctions and sent Javelin missiles to Ukraine. The message was clear: cross this line, and we'll make you pay. And what happened? Russia called our bluff. They invaded in 2022, and we responded with more sanctions and more weapons. And now, 8 years later, we're in the same position, only this time, the stakes are higher. Because this time, Russia has nuclear weapons. And this time, China is watching. Here's the uncomfortable truth: we're not prepared for a two-front war. The US military is designed to fight one major conflict at a time. We don't have the manpower, the industrial base, or the political will to take on Russia and China simultaneously. And yet, that's exactly what we're doing. We're sending billions to Ukraine while preparing for a potential conflict with China over Taiwan. It's madness. Now, I'm not saying we should abandon Ukraine. But we need to be honest about what's at stake. This isn't about democracy or human rights. It's about power. It's about whether the US can maintain its dominance in a world that's moving toward multipolarity. And right now, the answer is no. So what's the solution? First, we need to recognize that we can't fight every battle. We need to prioritize. And right now, China is the bigger threat. Russia is a declining power. China is a rising one. We need to focus on deterring Beijing, not bleeding Moscow. Second, we need to rebuild our industrial base. The US can't fight a modern war without a modern defense industry. And right now, we're relying on allies and contractors to keep Ukraine supplied. That's not sustainable. We need to bring production back home. Third, we need to rethink our alliances. NATO is a relic of the Cold War. It's time to update it for the 21st century. We need to bring in new members like Japan, Australia, and South Korea to counter China. And we need to stop treating Europe as a junior partner. They need to take responsibility for their own defense. Finally, we need to accept that the world is changing. The unipolar moment is over. We're entering an era of great power competition. And if we don't adapt, we're going to lose. The war in Ukraine is a wake-up call. But if we keep hitting the snooze button, we're going to wake up to a world where America is no longer the dominant power. And that's a world none of us should want to live in. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a military problem, it's a domestic political disaster waiting to happen. The American people are being sold a bill of goods, and when the bill comes due, the establishment won't be the ones paying it. The Pentagon's own 2023 National Defense Strategy admits we're in a decisive decade where China and Russia are working in tandem to erode US influence. But what does Congress do? It throws money at the problem like a drunk sailor at last call, while the defense industrial base rots from neglect. Let me explain why this matters. The US hasn't fought a peer competitor since Korea. Vietnam was a proxy war, the Gulf Wars were turkey shoots, and Afghanistan was a 20-year counterinsurgency boondoggle. We've forgotten what it takes to fight a real war. Our last major industrial mobilization was World War II, when we turned Detroit into an arsenal of democracy in less than 2 years. Today? We can't even produce enough artillery shells for Ukraine without stripping our own stockpiles. The Army's 155mm production line is running at a fraction of Cold War capacity, and the Navy's shipbuilding budget is a joke compared to China's. Beijing is outbuilding us 200-to-1 in shipyards, and we're still debating whether to fund another Ford-class carrier. Here's the uncomfortable: the American political class is sleepwalking into a crisis. The Biden administration's national security strategy reads like a graduate student's term paper, full of buzzwords like integrated deterrence and rules-based order, but no actual plan for how to win. Meanwhile, the Republicans are stuck in a time warp, obsessing over culture wars while the world burns. You want to know why we're in this mess? Look at the last 3 administrations. Obama pivoted to Asia but got bogged down in the Middle East. Trump talked tough on China but gutted the State Department and alienated our allies. Biden inherited a mess and made it worse by doubling down on Ukraine without a coherent strategy. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election, because that's where this all comes to a head. If Trump wins, we're looking at a foreign policy earthquake. He'll pull the rug out from under Ukraine, force Europe to pay for its own defense, and try to cut a deal with Putin. The problem? Putin doesn't do deals, he does conquest. And if Trump thinks he can charm Xi Jinping into backing off Taiwan, he's delusional. China's not interested in transactional diplomacy, it's playing the long game. A Trump victory would accelerate America's retreat from the world stage, and the vacuum would be filled by Beijing and Moscow before the inauguration confetti hits the ground. But if Biden wins? We're in for more of the same: endless aid to Ukraine, empty threats to China, and a military stretched thinner than a $2 bill. The Pentagon's budget will keep growing, but the money will go to the same defense contractors who've been fleecing the taxpayer for decades. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon will keep raking in profits while our soldiers train with broomsticks because we can't afford real equipment. And don't even get me started on the debt. We're borrowing $1 trillion every 100 days to fund this madness, and no one in Washington seems to care. The Chinese sure do, though. They're dumping U.S. Treasury bonds like they're radioactive. Here's the scenario no one in D.C. wants to talk: what happens when the American people wake up and realize they've been lied to? Not just about Ukraine or Taiwan, but about the entire post-Cold War order. For 30 years, we've been told that globalization and democracy promotion would lead to a peaceful, prosperous world. Instead, we got a financial crisis, a demic, and 2 near-peer competitors who want to bury us. The American middle class has been hollowed out, our cities are crumbling, and our politicians are more interested in virtue signaling than solving problems. When the reckoning comes, and it will, it won't be pretty. Let me give you a historical parallel. In 1914, Europe was a powder keg, but no one thought war was possible. The elites were too interconnected, the economies too dependent on each other. Then Archduke Franz Ferdinand got shot, and within weeks, the continent was in flames. Today, we're in a similar moment. The US is the global hegemon, but our position is more fragile than at any time since the 1930s. One miscalculation in the Taiwan Strait or the Baltics, and we're looking at a conflict that makes Ukraine look like a border skirmish. So what's the way out? First, we need to stop pretending that we can do everything. The era of American omnipotence is over. We need to pick our battles, and right now, that means focusing on China. Russia is a nuisance, China is an existential threat. Second, we need to rebuild our industrial base, not just for defense, but for the economy. The CHIPS Act was a start, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what China's doing. Third, we need to fix our broken political system. Term limits, campaign finance reform, and an end to the revolving door between government and defense contractors. And finally, we need to level with the American people. No more happy talk about democracy spreading like wildfire. No more pretending that we can police the world on the cheap. The truth is, we're in a fight for our future, and if we don't get serious, we're going to lose.